Hi, Sparks here. So this is my second video in the Making of Chromie series. This video is going to be on patterning. This is going to be me patterning fitted garments that will go underneath of armor and then pattern the armor itself. You can just go to the store, buy a sewing pattern that's similar to what you're looking for, and then alter that pattern. Or you can even find clothing that's already made that's similar to what you want and either alter it and use that clothing or cut it apart at the seams and trace it onto new fabric. But basically, my process is to cover the dress form or myself in plastic wrap and then masking tape. And then the masking tape allows me to draw my armor or clothing designs right onto it. The plastic wrap allows it to peel off after I've cut it apart, and then I have patterns that I can trace onto fabric or EVA foam. You might want to consider putting the bra that you're going to be wearing on your mannequin if you plan on wearing any sort of shapewear or corset that will change your shape underneath your garments. Consider putting those things on your mannequin and adjusting the size of your mannequin to fit those new measurements. The other thing I do to prepare is think about how my armor is actually going to attach. So over the years, I've made lots of different types of harnesses to hook my shoulder armors to, and sometimes wings and things like that on my back. So some of the styles that I have liked using are the just plain old backpack straps. And usually, in order to keep those straps from sliding backwards onto, like, off my shoulders, I either put a strap across here or under my breast. Other types of harnesses that I've made in the past are the crisscross. So you just crisscross them in the front, and I've done crisscross in the back. So depending on what the armor is and how I need to brace it. So if my armor and my garments are low cut in the front, I know I can't have any sort of straps in the front. So just keep that in mind when you go to start patterning your garments, because you then can plan where holes need to go in your garments to pull buckles through or Velcro. You can plan, okay, I need to make sure that the sleeve comes down far enough to cover my harness strap. Otherwise, you might have things like straps, buckles, magnets, Velcro, elastic, whatever, showing in your costume. So if you keep that in mind, if you make your harness right now and say, this is the type of harness I'm going for, you can make it and then pattern over it. The next step that I'm going to do is cover the entire mannequin. I'm probably actually going to do about to here. I'll pattern the top and the belt on the mannequin, and then for the skirt, I will create a paper skirt that I will use to create the pattern. Here is my plastic wrap. I find it's easiest just to take it out of the holder or the box. And you just want to make sure you cover everything so that your tape doesn't stick directly to your dress form or yourself. So just make sure when you are coming to areas like the breast area, or anywhere where there's a lot of curvature, that you don't pull it super tight. Because if you pull it super tight, it's going to create like this wall that's going to create this flat section. And if you're doing something like stormtrooper armor or something like that, where you just want one big flat panel, you can absolutely use your plastic wrap and tape to create that pattern so it is just straight across. But if you're looking to make individual breast cups, like in most fantasy-based armor, you want to make sure that your plastic wrap is loose so that when you put your tape on, you can get in between and create the individual breasts. So the best way for me that I have found is to start out doing a crisscross in the front. And so I usually lay down half of the tape, and then in order to avoid unnatural shapes and gaps, like you can see in here, if I pull this straight, it's going to create a weird gap in here, and then it's not actually going to hug the curves as they actually are. So I lay it down about halfway, and then for the rest of it, I kind of just let it go wherever it wants to go. Okay, now that it's all covered in tape, I'm going to make a few reference markers. So I always measure the distance between my shoulders. That's basically where the seam of a t-shirt or something would sit. That's where the tops of your sleeves are going to go. So I know on myself that's about 15 inches. So I've marked here and here 7.5 inches from the center of the neck. Okay, so the next spot that I make sure that I mark is this distance between the top of the shoulder and the base of the neck, where I would want a neckline or collar to sit. If I were to use the mannequin's neck, you can see my neck is much shorter and much wider than the mannequin's neck. So I don't want to go off of that. I want to go off of my body, so that if I were to say, okay, I want to put a high collar right up against here on me, it's going to be like digging into my throat, and we don't want that. So I'm going to measure the distance between the top of my shoulder and where a comfortable position for a collar or neckline would be. And then to the top of my shoulder is about 4.25 inches. So I'm going to measure from that shoulder line and measure in about 4.25 inches. So the other measurement that I like to mark is my belly button. So I've already marked that here. I measured up from the floor to where my belly button is. And now that allows me to have sort of a guideline as to where the waistline of my skirt, my belt, how far down my armor is going to go. I can use then on myself and go, okay, I want that to sit up above my belly button. So now I know where my belly button is. So the way I measure my armholes is to make a loop with a tape measure. And wrap it around and hold it at the top and make it just tight enough that your arm fits in it and you can move your arm freely. Then I just wrap that tape measure with that measurement around the arm of the dress form and trace it. Okay, so now I have an armhole that I can use as a guideline. I have a distance between here. I have where my belly button is. And then the other thing you can do is if you want to measure your neckline. So just like with the armhole, so now I have a neckline drawn that should help act as a guide as well. For when I'm doing a fitted piece and I'm actually drawing the patterns directly onto my form, I try to only use one half. If I make a ton of mistakes, that gives me the other half to then redraw everything on. If I don't make that many mistakes and I'm able to use that first half, I'm then able to use the second half for my chest armor patterns, and then I don't have to masking tape the whole thing again. But I've made a dotted line, so now when I do end up cutting the pattern out, I just need to remember along that dotted line, everything gets doubled. Sometimes you might wonder, how do you know like how wide to make something? Especially with armor, how giant to make a shoulder. I actually use a website called, I think it's pronounced Nifegun. It's Nifegun.com, and I'll link it down below the video. And in that website, you upload an image of your character, and then you have a line marker, and you draw a line from the top of the head to the bottom of the feet, and you tell it how tall you are. So I'm 5'2", so I said that Chromie was 5'2". So now any other line that I draw on her, so from here to the tip of her shoulder, it's going to figure out if Chromie was 5'2", how big her shoulder would be. So that can help you decide how long a shirt should be, or how, she's got like sashes and things like that. How wide are those sashes? She has a gem here. How big is that gem? Stuff like that. You also can then just use your body. So if she has a shirt that comes just under her breasts and just over her breasts, I can just draw here and draw there. So sometimes you're going to go based off of yourself, because say it told me that her shirt here was only 6 inches, and I knew if I made it 6 inches on me, it was not going to be very flattering. I'd be showing way too much cleavage and stuff. So I'm going to adjust it to a point where I'm comfortable. And so you can always alter that kind of stuff. Even with her midriff. If I didn't want her midriff, I just continue her shirt all the way down. So I'm actually going to create a high collar. And to do that, I'm going to use some builder's paper. I use this paper method pretty much any time that I have a part that I'm going to be using interfacing with. Interfacing is something that you add to fabric, to a garment, during the sewing process that makes fabric stiffer. And so I do need to create some sort of pattern for her little cap sleeve. Once I'm done the cap sleeve pattern, then I just move on to drawing the rest of the pieces of the shirt, which is that little black bolero sort of piece. I just draw what I see on my reference images. She has armor that goes over it, so I just kind of use my imagination as to what I think that her shirt underneath looks like. And so on the back, I draw like a little peekaboo hole. And then that's pretty much it for her shirt pattern. And now I can move on to drawing the belt. And I just sort of decide where I want it to go and how thick I want it to be, and then draw a V-shaped belt pattern. I ended up wanting it about 4 inches, if I recall, and so I just kind of eyed it, and then once I cut it out and I get it flat and I go to actually put it onto fabric, I can clean up my lines and I can make it more precise. To make my A-line skirt pattern, I'm going to take this piece of paper and get it down to where the hips are, and then let the paper fall at the angle that the hips are at. Okay. So you can see there's still a gap at the bottom, and my butt would be showing because this comes down so far. So I'm actually going to take another piece of paper and lay it here and fill that section. So you can see the front right now matches the floor very well. It's just off the floor. But the back has a bit of a gap. But once I cut the pattern off and I lay it flat, it's much easier to work with. And I'll just match the back to the length of the front once I do that. Okay, so now I'm going to start patterning the chest armor. I'm actually starting with the collar armor first. When I made her the first time, I made this gold collar piece as a piece of armor that was connected to her shoulders. And I've seen over the years a lot of other Chromie cosplayers interpret that gold piece as fabric. So you can interpret things however you want. I personally like it as an armor piece because it is the same gold color that her chest armor is, and so it makes sense to me to have it be an actual armor piece and not just gold fabric. So I sketched that out and then moved on to the chest armor. And I just try to get the shapes as close as I can. Transferring designs from a video game character onto a human can sometimes be tricky because it's a video game and things aren't real, and sometimes they just don't work out in real life. So I just do the best that I can and sketch and erase and sketch again. And so a lot of times I'll just cover entire sections in masking tape again and completely redraw them. And then other times I'll decide while I'm drawing my armor that I need the clothing pattern to change a little bit so that it lines up differently. So I'll go back over to the clothing side of my pattern and resketch over there. And so just constantly changing and evolving until I'm happy with it. And I don't really do too much detail drawing on this, like her little swirlies and stuff. I rough sketch them, but once I make her real patterns during the foam armor phase, I'll get more precise. All right, so next up is shoulder armor. So what I end up doing is, because shoulders stick up off the body, I find it easiest to just build like a ball or something that's going to make it the general shape, and then cover that in the plastic wrap and masking tape, just like I do with my dress form, and then that gives me something that's the correct shape to draw on. And I do the same thing with the paper. If there's horns and things like that that need to be patterned, I will like tape all kinds of crazy things onto those basic shapes that I've made out of paper and tape and aluminum foil, like whatever I needed to create those base shoulders. I'll just start gluing paper and horns and all kinds of stuff on them to create my patterns. Now we're going to start cutting everything off. Due to space, I've already removed the skirt portion of the pattern that I made. I'm just gonna like clean up the line on the top. That'll be my new waistline. And then the only other thing I have to do is, because that bottom part didn't 100% match up with the pieces of paper, there's that like little gap at the bottom. I'm just going to get another piece of paper and continue the hemline all the way across the back so it's straight. So there's not really too much to be done with the skirt pattern. It's pretty self-explanatory. And like I said earlier, you can just buy a circle skirt pattern or an A-line skirt pattern or whatever it is that you need. You can buy one at the craft store and modify it, modify the length or whatever you need to do to be able to make it fit your costume. I'm going to work on the half that we patterned for her garments first. Okay, so we have to figure out how we're going to make the pattern sit flat, and that means seams and darts. So I tend to always put a seam at the top of the shoulder. It's where most shirts have a seam and armor covers it. So I just drew a dotted line right at the top there, and then I can cut there because I'm going to be creating a seam there anyway. And then you can just use a blade and some scissors and carefully cut the rest of your pattern off of your form. Okay, so when I patterned her top, I patterned all of the pieces of her top on one pattern. So the parts that I outlined in blue were the white parts of her shirt. The parts that I outlined in black were the black parts of her shirt. So what that means is if I cut out the blue part, I'm cutting out parts of the black part as well. So whenever I do this style of patterning, I do this with garments and with armor, where I will now cut it apart. So I'll cut the white part of the pattern out. I'll trace it onto paper so that I have that pattern separately. And then I'll tape this pattern back together so then I can go back and cut out the black part and then make my pattern for that. So I'm going to cut out the white part. How do I make something like this into a pattern? It's obviously dome shaped because it goes over my breast. When you're sewing, you use something called darts. You'll notice sometimes when you buy a shirt, it'll have little seams either like in the top here, or it'll have little seams in under here. Those are to help your clothing hug your curves. I think having a dart here makes sense. So I'm going to draw a little dotted line. Okay. So now I'm going to cut approximately where I made that dotted line. As you can see, I can now flatten my pattern. Now there is some wrinkling, but that's okay. It doesn't need to be 100% perfect. Okay, so I have my piece of paper here. And when you are patterning fabric, this is where it differs from patterning armor. I'm going to be tracing this pattern. Now, if I was making armor, which I will show you when we get there, I would trace this V, because when I go to make that breast cup curve for my armor, I actually am going to cut that out and glue it together in order to help create that curve. On fabric, you want to continue that shape so that it gives you this extra fabric. And then when you go to put it on your dress form, or when you're fitting it on yourself, it'll be baggy, but it allows you to then use that extra fabric and pin it so you can figure out where you'll dart it to help create those curves and help fit it to your body. And I will go over that in the sewing video, which will be the next video. So I'm continuing that line to create the full curve, which will give me that extra fabric in that area where I'm going to create a dart. And it will add like a baggy spot and it'll look kind of weird, but when we go to fit the garment, it'll make sense. Here. And this is that weird area that I made for my dart. So when this is fabric, it'll be a lot easier to manipulate. But as you can see, it gives me an area that I can pinch. And then when I sew here, right now it makes a very pointy cone boob. But in fabric, it works much nicer. It gives a much softer line because I continue the stitching down to blend it. Another way to do this kind of curving the fabric to get it to hug curves of your body like breasts and hips and things is to add additional seams. So instead of a dart here, what I can do is actually continue this line all the way down and give myself a whole new seam. And I may end up doing that if I don't like the way that the darting is working out, but luckily it's being covered in armor. It's going to have the little black jacket and then a piece of armor over top of it. So I now am going to tape this back together so that I can cut the black section of the shirt out. So once I was done using the mannequin to remind myself how everything lined up, I just laid it down on the table and matched up the blue lines with the other blue lines and the black lines with the other black lines, and taped it back together as I followed those black lines and cut out the little bolero jacket pattern. And then pretty much all of the fabric things were done. Okay, so I think that this pattern's fine. I don't think I need to trace it onto paper. So I'm just going to pin it to my form. And a lot of my decisions when it comes to sewing get made in the test phase when I'm working with muslin or scrap fabric. I may make huge adjustments in that time. So these are all just my like rough estimate kind of patterns, how I think that things should go. Once you get your fabric in hand, things can go very differently, especially if you have stretchy fabric or you expected it to have a little bit of give and it's not at all. So I've already chosen my fabrics. I know which fabrics that I've chosen have stretch and which ones don't. So I kind of have that in my mind the whole time. But when I'm patterning, I try not to rely on having stretch or having that extra give. I want everything to fit nicely and not be too tight and things like that. So I may make big adjustments in the test phase when I get to my fabric, but all of that will be part of the sewing video. So now I'm going to start patterning the armor side. So I'm carefully removing the armor patterns from the armor half of the dress form. And then I cut apart all of the armor pieces. Then I'm going to draw a line following the bottom of the breast cup so that I can cut the breast cup apart from the rest of the chest armor, like the waist area, because I want to be able to work with just that severe dome shape of the breast cup alone without it being attached to the rest of the chest armor. I have my breast cup, which is a dome that I need to get to lay flat, just like when I patterned the garments underneath. Getting curve and foam can be tricky, take some practice, but I use a combination of heat and darts. So when I'm flattening my pattern, I choose where my darts are going to be. And then when I go to make the actual breast cup out of foam, I manipulate it with the heat over and over and over until I get it the shape that I want and I get the roundness I want. And then I glue all of those darts together. And then I have my curved piece of foam. So I'm going to decide where I'm going to put my darts. Normally I go by where the most drastic part of the curve is. So for me, that's typically somewhere in here to make my first dart. And then I'm going to cut that. Okay, so that's a good start, but as you can see, still not completely flat. To get the rest of the breast cup to sit flat, just continue to cut more slits and eventually it'll go flat. The fewer slits that you can make, the better, because that's less seams that you have to deal with. But if you have large breasts like I do, sometimes it's just the easiest way. But this is going to be my weird breast cup pattern. And it looks really funny, but once you glue those slits back together, it will create a dome shape. For the shoulders, I marked a line down the approximate center and used that as a sort of seam to carefully cut the pattern off of the weird ball of paper and tinfoil that I had made. I don't really need to get too complicated with the pattern for the shoulders. They don't have much to them. A lot of the swirls and all that kind of stuff are going to be freehand done in thermoplastic or foam clay or something like that. And the bottom two tiers of the shoulders are just basically curved triangles. And it's hard for me to get those shapes out of paper. So I'm just going to wait until I get actual EVA foam in hand and play with it and see what curve I want and what shape I actually want them at that time. For the top tier, though, it does have a more rounded area in the center. So I'm going to cut apart the top tier, and then I'm going to add a dart where I feel that it needs one in order for it to lay more flat. And then just like with the breast cups, when I go to build it, I'll heat form them and I will glue that dart back together. It'll help create that curve, and then I'll have a domed shoulder. So that is it for patterning. As I go along, I'll be remaking patterns, I'll be adjusting patterns. The next video is going to be sewing. So I'm going to take the sewing patterns from the mannequin that we made here and try to get them to look like clothing. So keep an eye out for that video. And I will see you next time. Bye.